She stepped off the train into the wrong town with the right man watching from the shadows. No husband waiting, no name called. Just a wind-swept platform. A broken promise, and a stranger who said, "You weren't supposed to be here." But what if she was? What if the biggest mistake of her life was the only thing standing between one man's ruin and one town's redemption? The wind came first, dry and sharp as broken glass, scraping across the empty platform with a sound like whispering bones. Dust caught in the woman's veil, clinging to lace that once spoke of ceremony but now sagged heavy with soot and miles. Before we ride further into the dust where truth hides behind drawn guns and whispered names, take a breath and tap that like button, subscribe to the channel, and help us keep the campfire burning. Every bit of support lets us keep chasing the echoes of those who stood their ground with shaking hands and hearts too stubborn to quit. For the women who stepped off trains with no one waiting, for the men who chose mercy over survival, for every soul who wasn't supposed to belong but stayed anyway, your click keeps their stories alive. Thank you for riding with us. She stood with her back to the tracks, boots cracked and pale at the seams, her trunk beside her like a coffin no one claimed. The train was gone, not late, gone. Its final whistle had long since bled into the black horizon, leaving only silence and the wheezing sighs of an abandoned depot groaning in the cold. Above her, the station's sign swung crooked on rusted chains, one word painted in a font that might have been hopeful once: Needlepoint. Not Needleton, where she was meant to arrive. No welcome committee. No groom with a flower in his lapel, just peeling paint, broken windows, and the smell of cattle dung riding the wind like a warning. She adjusted her bonnet with slow fingers, skin raw from travel and heat and second thoughts. Her name was Emma, though that fact felt thin out here. A city syllable that didn't quite hold up against the emptiness. The stars were thick above, but cold, mocking. No constellations she recognized, just endless sky stretching like judgment. Behind her, gravel shifted. Not the wind this time. A single footfall. Then another. Measured. Not hurried. She didn't turn. "Ma'am," came a voice. Low, scratchy, like it had been used more for swearing and sermons than pleasantries. "You're not supposed to be here." She turned slowly. A man stepped forward out of the dark, broad-shouldered, a shadow in a duster coat, wide-brimmed hat pulled low. His eyes, when she saw them, weren't unkind. But they weren't welcoming either. They were assessing. Like she was a riddle, carved into the dirt. Before she could answer, more movement surged behind him. Torchlight flared. 4 figures emerged from the dark edge of the station yard, rifles slung, boots crunching in staggered rhythm. Their faces were half-shadowed, half-painted in flickers of orange flame. One of them muttered something she couldn't catch. The others laughed like it wasn't a joke. The first man didn't laugh. He stepped between her and them, one hand resting on something inside his coat. Not threatening, not yet. "I asked who you are," he said again. Not louder, just firmer. She opened her mouth, but what came out wasn't her name. It was a tremor, a breath that hitched and froze in her throat. He saw it. "Stay behind me," he said without looking back. From the shadows, one of the torchmen called out. "That your bride, Asa? Bit early for spring flowers." The man Asa then didn't answer. Another voice chimed in, rougher. "She's mail order, ain't she? Got lost in the wrong county. Shame to waste her." Emma's fists clenched. No one moved. The torches bobbed closer. Asa's hand came out of his coat, slow and deliberate, a gleam of metal catching moonlight. "Don't," he said. They froze. The wind picked up again, hard enough to drown breath. And then, a gun cocked, not his. Behind the others, a fifth man stepped into view, taller, older, with a badge half polished on his chest. "Put it down, Danner," he said. "You don't get to make rules just 'cause a woman landed wrong." Asa didn't lower his weapon, but his jaw locked. The marshal's eyes slid to Emma. "You don't belong here, ma'am. Not in this town, not with him." Emma finally spoke. "I didn't choose this place." The marshal grinned without humor. "Maybe not, but it chose you." The torches flared in the wind. 5 men, 1 woman, 1 cowboy standing between. And nowhere to run. The letter crinkled in her gloved hand, its creases now worn deep like veins across a map, guiding her somewhere half-promised and wholly unknown. Emma LeClaire stood at the edge of the platform in Street Louis, her traveling bag at her feet, the steam from the engine curling around her skirts like a restless spirit. A final call rang out across the station, Needleton, Colorado, last boarding. She stepped forward, her heart louder than the train whistle, boots clicking sharp against the boards. She didn't look back. There was nothing behind her but debts, whispers, and the rotting wreckage of her father's tailor shop turned debtor's auction. She had answered the ad in quiet desperation. God-fearing rancher seeks honest, sturdy wife, Christian household, will provide land, food, and dignity. It had come signed only with a first name, James. No photograph, no poetry. Just the stark offer of survival written in ink that bled slightly through the cheap parchment. It was, by any worldly measure, a gamble. But Emma knew the odds of staying were worse. Inside the train, the seats were half filled with farmhands and freight, mothers with babies wrapped in quilts, old men chewing tobacco in silence. She tucked the letter into her handbag like a prayer and sat by the window, watching the city peel away behind them, brick by brick, chimney by chimney, until there was only prairie and open sky. Each mile west seemed to thin her breath but harden her resolve. She didn't speak to anyone. Not for the first hour. Not for the first day. The wheels clacked out a rhythm beneath her. You chose this, you chose this, you chose this. When the conductor finally passed through on the 3rd day, she showed him the note with the town's name written at the bottom. Needleton, she said quietly. He gave a nod that felt vaguely uncertain. You'll want the stop after 2 Forks, miss. Should be Saturday morning if the weather holds. But when the train slowed with a screech of brakes, the sign outside the dusty depot didn't say Needleton. It said Wrong Gulch. She blinked, thought maybe it was a joke. The conductor was already stepping off, helping an old woman with her cane. Emma followed, hesitant, watching the others disperse. When she asked the station master, a hunched man with sweat-stained suspenders, he squinted at her like she'd asked about the moon. Needleton, he muttered. Train don't go there direct. This here's a stop for livestock and misfortune. You must have gotten the routing mixed. She opened her mouth. But the conductor, he said, after 2 Forks. That'd be Silvervale, the man cut in. Next week's train might take you closer if the floods recede. Till then, you're planted. Emma stared past him. There was nothing here but boarded windows, rusted rails, and a cracked water tower. No telegraph lines, no post. Just heat and silence. 30 miles south, she thought. Her intended was 30 miles south. She didn't know if he'd be expecting her today. She didn't even know if he was real. Just a name and a hope. Her bag hit the platform with a thud. She sat down beside it, bones aching, pride clenched like a fist in her throat. Around her, the dust rose and danced in lazy spirals. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then nothing. A week in this place? She pulled the letter back out and unfolded it. The ink was fading. The words already looked older than they should. Her fingers traced the signature again. James. She whispered it aloud. No one answered. The sun had long since surrendered to a dry, copper dusk when the horse clattered into Wrong Gulch, its rider cutting a lonely figure against the dying light. Asa Danner dismounted without ceremony, his boots hitting the dust with a weight that made the ground seem quieter. He didn't tie the horse, he never needed to. The animal knew his silences better than most men ever had. He stepped onto the platform, scanning the depot with the sharp, deliberate glance of someone who expected little and still prepared for less. A crate of supplies was meant to be waiting. A shipment of seed, some tool parts, rifle cartridges, and a coil of fencing wire. But the loading dock was empty, save for a broken crate leaking nails and a stack of weather-beaten newspapers from 3 towns over. Asa muttered something under his breath, short, clipped, not quite profanity, and took off his hat to wipe his brow. That's when he noticed her. Sitting near the end of the bench, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to disappear into her own spine, was a woman in travel-worn lace and boots that had seen too many miles. Her eyes tracked him the way a stray tracks a boot, half hope, half warning. She didn't speak. Neither did he. It was the Bible that shifted first, pressing uncomfortably against his ribs inside his coat, like it had something to say. He ignored it. He walked past her. Then stopped. Turned back. "You waiting for someone?" he asked. Voice low, hoarse from wind and weather, and too many conversations avoided. She lifted her chin, and even with the dust on her face and fatigue in her spine, there was something unbent in her gaze. "Yes," she said, then paused. "No, I mean I was." He glanced down the empty tracks, then at the town. "You ain't from here." "I was headed to Needleton," she said. "Got off at the wrong stop." He nodded once. "Needleton's a day's ride. South, by dry riverbed. No stage runs from here till next week. You got family waiting?" "A man," she said, too quickly. Then steadier. "A marriage arrangement." He didn't respond. Just let the silence stretch. She added, "And I don't know anyone here. Not one soul." He looked out past the depot. The tavern was already stirring with voices and slamming doors. Wrong Gulch was the kind of town where a woman alone became a story before nightfall. And this one had clearly stepped into the wrong book. Against his better judgment and the knot forming between his ribs, he gestured toward his horse. "I got room in the bunkhouse. It's plain, but safe." She stiffened, instinct flickering in her eyes. "Why would you offer that?" He didn't answer right away, just pulled the Bible from his coat and tapped it once with a calloused finger. "Doesn't let me sleep right if I don't." She studied him. Dust in his beard. Lines around the eyes, like someone who squinted into wind more than smiles. A man built like a gate, meant to hold back storms. "Just the night," she said. He nodded. And as they walked down the main path, side by side but not together, Wrong Gulch watched from behind shuttered windows, whispers already beginning. He didn't care. She didn't ask where the bunkhouse was. And the wind picked up behind them, carrying grit and prophecy in equal measure. The first whisper bloomed in the saloon over a spilled glass of rye. By the time the sun had set again, it had grown legs and teeth and started to walk. Emma LeClaire, the stranger in Wrong Gulch with her Eastern manners and tight-laced silence, was living under Asa Danner's roof unwed, unspoken for, and wholly out of place. The bunkhouse she slept in might have been 20 paces from his door, but to the town, it may as well have been his bed. In a place that measured virtue by distance and shadows, neither were far enough. By the second morning, women stopped waving from porches. By the third, the general store clerk wouldn't meet her eye. At Sunday service, Emma sat alone on the back pew, eyes fixed on her lap, as Reverend Wilkes thundered about the slow decay of moral order in this land, without ever naming her, but carving her name in every syllable just the same. Asa sat 2 pews ahead, arms crossed. He didn't flinch when Wilkes's gaze slid to him mid-sermon. He didn't bow when the benediction came. He just stood and left, tipping his hat only to the widow Marks, who had buried 2 sons and knew better than to judge how God delivered salvation. The pressure didn't ease in private. One afternoon, Asa returned from checking the herd to find a visitor waiting on the porch. Clive Langley, the third son of the Langleys, spread just north of his. Clive had that lean, vulture patience, always smiling, always circling. "You're entertaining guests now, Danner?" Clive asked, arms folded, boots clean like he hadn't touched dirt in weeks. "Odd time to play house." "She ain't a guest," Asa said. "She's just stranded." Clive's smile widened. "Stranded's what fences are for, friend. Keep what don't belong from sticking around too long." He didn't stay long, but the message settled like frost. The Langleys had been eyeing Asa's land for years, one border dispute from turning talk into bullets. Now they had a whisper to fan. That night, as the wind came down off the hills like a cold breath, Emma woke to a glow out the window. She stepped out barefoot, nightgown clinging to her knees. Out by the fence line, fire licked upward across, crude and splintered, burning against the sky like judgment made manifest. She didn't scream, just stood there, shaking, as Asa came running from the barn with a bucket and fury in his stride. He doused it before it spread. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, she said, voice low, "I'll leave. First light. I'll walk to Needleton if I have to." He didn't answer right away, just stared into the steam rising from the wet ash. Then, "That's what they want." "I'm not worth this," she whispered. Asa turned to her, face carved in moonlight. "No one earns their worth by standing alone in a storm. Not you, not me." She looked down. He stepped closer. "God doesn't make mistakes. Maybe he sent you to the wrong station for the right reason." The wind caught the hem of her gown and made it flicker like a candle in threat of extinguishing. She didn't reply, but she didn't pack, either. Inside, the Bible sat on his table, closed but not forgotten. Outside, the embers cooled, but the heat beneath the town would only rise. The church bell rang sharp and early, cutting through the haze of morning like an axe through frozen bark. The town had gathered in full, not for worship, but for judgment. The meeting was called informal, but every bench was filled, every eye fixed toward the front, where the altar had been cleared of candles and hymn books replaced instead by tension, heavy and electric. Emma sat near the back, spine straight, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her dress was clean, pressed by candlelight the night before, as if decency could be stitched into cotton. Her hat sat low to hide her eyes, but not low enough to block the whispers. They rippled around her like wind before a storm, soft, slicing, insistent. Up front, Reverend Wilk stood behind the lectern, hands pressed flat, voice gravel thick. "This is not about cruelty," he said. "It is about order, about the expectations we keep if we aim to call ourselves civilized. A woman under a man's roof, unmarried, is a provocation, a temptation, a disruption." Murmurs of agreement rose, quiet but serrated. Asa stood beside the pews, arms crossed over his chest, hat clutched in one hand, boots spread like he was bracing for a fight. He hadn't spoken yet, not since arriving, but he didn't need to. His silence was its own defiance. "This ain't about sin," a farmer muttered from the side. "It's about what her being here stirs up. Look at the Langleys itching for excuse." Wilkes seized the thread. "Exactly. Asa Danner's land may soon be ours to defend. But we cannot defend disorder. If she were a wife, it'd be different. If there were a covenant under God, it'd be different. But she is not, and there is none." Asa stepped forward. Just one step, but the floorboards groaned like they knew what was coming. "She came here by mistake," he said. "I offered shelter, nothing more, nothing less. She's harmed no one." Wilkes didn't flinch. "Your house is now the center of division." "Then that's your problem," Asa shot back, "not hers." A sharp intake of breath swept the room like wind in a dry barn. Wilkes turned to Emma. "Speak your piece, miss. we'll hear it." She rose, slower than the silence that followed. Her voice was even. "I didn't come to Wrong Gulch on purpose. I came for a man who doesn't exist. I stayed because the one who does never asked anything of me. Never took. Never struck. Never stared like I was something to buy or tame. He's the only man who's treated me like more than cargo on a rail line." The room fell still. Not one cough, not one foot shuffle. The quiet felt dangerous. Wilkes nodded slowly. "Then marry him," he said, each word landing with finality. "Or leave." Emma's mouth parted, but no sound came. Asa didn't move. The town watched, breath caught in their collective throat. The moment stretched. Smash cut to black. Would you say yes if it meant safety, but not love? The wind carried ash from the east that morning, scattering it across the clapboard streets of Wrong Gulch like a warning dressed in soot. Emma walked alone, the church bell echoing behind her like a bad memory. The vote hadn't happened yet. The town still hung in limbo, waiting for her answer, wed or gone. She had no appetite for breakfast, only a restless gnawing that pushed her into town with no destination in mind. Her boots carried her past the mercantile, past the silent windows of the tailor's shop, and finally to the edge of the post office, where crates of discarded paper and packing scraps were dumped for burn or reuse. A page caught her eye. Folded. Torn at the edge. Yellowed like it had never found light. She might have passed it, should have, but something about the slant of the writing, the curl of a certain letter, tugged at her chest like a rope made of memory. She bent down and tugged it free from the splinters. It was an envelope familiar in size, the paper thick and Eastern pressed. Her fingers trembled. Her name was on it. Emma LeClaire. In handwriting she didn't recognize. The ink bled slightly, as if it had been written in haste or with a nervous hand. She turned it over. The seal had been cracked, but what lay inside was worse. No letter. Only a torn scrap half of what should have been a promise. The name signed at the bottom, James Halbrook. The supposed man she'd been sent for. But in the place where a return address should have been, she found something else. Langley Stationery and Feed. Wrong Gulch. Her breath caught, her vision narrowed. Clive Langley. She walked fast, too fast, through alleyways, past wagons and horses, not caring who watched. Her mind replayed the letter, the signature, the missing words, over and over like a broken prayer wheel. It wasn't a love letter, it was a lure. She burst into Asa's barn just as he was tightening a saddle strap. Dust rose in a cloud, catching in her throat. "I found this," she said, holding the envelope out like a weapon. "You need to see it." He took it, slowly, calloused fingers brushing hers without meaning to. He unfolded the scrap, his brows tightening. "I don't understand," he murmured. "There was never a James Halbrook," she said, voice trembling. "This letter, it's forged. Langley paper, Langley ink. They sent it so I'd show up in the wrong town, stir up trouble under your roof. They baited you." Asa's jaw set. The veins in his forearms flared as his hands folded the envelope back into something that didn't shake. "You're saying they used you, to get to me?" She nodded. "They didn't count on you, giving me shelter. They wanted scandal. Leverage. They wanted this town to turn on you." His eyes met hers, no pity, just fire. "They used your hope like a hammer." She looked down, ashamed of her own gullibility. "I didn't know." "You weren't supposed to," he said. Outside, the town bustled in ignorance. But inside that barn, something shifted. The truth had weight, and now it had a name. He tucked the letter into his coat pocket. "This ain't over," he said. And in her gut, Emma knew Wrong Gulch hadn't seen the worst of it yet. The dust hadn't yet settled from the morning sun when the rider appeared on the ridge, tall in the saddle, coat flapping like a war banner. He bore no colors of allegiance. but the badge glinted sharp against his chest as he descended the slope with the slow, measured authority of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. The horse was black. The man was stone. By the time he rode into town, the children had vanished indoors, and shop doors stood slightly ajar, just enough for worried eyes to peek through. A stranger was cause enough for tension in Wrong Gulch. A federal marshal was something else entirely. Marshal Thomas Lyle didn't dismount at the saloon or the jailhouse. He rode straight to the church, where Reverend Wilkes was already waiting with a hand out and a file in the other. Words were exchanged, paper was passed. Then both men looked south, toward Asa Danner's land. Emma saw the dust trail first, then the horse, then the man. She was hanging a sheet on the line behind the bunkhouse when Asa came around the corner, rifle in hand, but not raised. His eyes had narrowed to slits. He recognized the posture, the clean boots, the purpose in the man's stride. "Marshal," Asa said as Lyle approached. "Danner," Lyle replied, slow and cold. "Need a word." Emma stood frozen. She wasn't invited but couldn't walk away. Lyle pulled a paper from his coat and read from it like scripture. "One Clive Langley has filed claim that you, Asa Danner, knowingly obstructed lawful land negotiations, harbored a fraudulent mail-order bride under false pretenses, and participated in mail interference by way of deceitful correspondence to gain moral advantage over a neighboring claim." Asa didn't blink. "You're saying I forged a letter to lure a woman and steal land?" "Among other things," Lyle said. "He's also alleging coercion." Emma stepped forward, breath shallow. "That's a lie." Lyle turned. "Ma'am, your name?" "Emma LeClaire." He reached into his saddlebag, pulled another file. "You're listed in the complaint as a potential co-conspirator. Care to explain how you arrived here under false documents?" She flushed. "I didn't. I thought I was answering a proposal. I was tricked." "And yet you remained, under his roof." "She had nowhere else," Asa said, jaw tight. "Plenty of boarding homes in Silver Vale," Lyle countered. Choices were made. Across the field, a figure approached on horseback, Clive Langley, clean-shaven and smiling like a man arriving for the reading of a will he'd forged himself. Well, he said, dismounting with practiced ease. "Told you justice would find its way here eventually. That's what happens when you take in strays, Danner. They start to think they belong." Asa didn't move. "You think this badge makes your lie law?" Clive grinned wider. "No, but it buys time. Time enough for the town to rethink who they trust to hold a fence line." Emma stepped forward, voice cutting through the rising wind. "You used me." Clive shrugged. "You let yourself be used. Difference." Lyle raised a hand. "Enough. I need both of you to ride with me. Statements will be taken. And if the evidence holds, charges follow." Asa glanced at Emma, something unreadable in his eyes. Then he nodded. "Let's ride." And as they mounted, the wind picked up again, carrying dust, ash, and the sour smell of betrayal. The town gathered once more under the blistered rafters of the church, but this time there was no sermon, no veil of scripture to soften the lines drawn between sides. The pews groaned with weight, not of bodies, but of consequence. The marshal stood near the altar, his badge dulled by dust, arms crossed like a gatekeeper. Clive Langley leaned against a post with a smirk stitched across his face, the confidence of a man who believed the law had already sealed its verdict in ink and handshakes. Asa Danner stood in the center, back straight, wrists raw from the cuffs removed just minutes before. His silence spoke louder than any plea could. And Emma stood beside him, her chin high though her hands trembled, clutching something close to her chest beneath a layer of cloth. Marshal Lyle cleared his throat. "The accusations stand, but the town has asked for testimony evidence, if such exists. Miss LeClaire, you claimed you were misled, yet you remained. Why?" Emma stepped forward, the murmurs fading to hush. She didn't answer with her voice first, but with her hands. She unwrapped the object she held, revealing Asa's Bible. Worn leather, creased at the spine, its edges darkened by time and sweat. Reverent silence followed as she held it up. "This is his," she said. "He keeps it in his coat, always. I found it one morning, left on the table like an afterthought. But when I opened it," she thumbed through the pages until she reached the inside cover. Carefully, she turned the book to face the room. There, scrawled in faded graphite on the flyleaf, was a name. Emma. Beneath it, a date. 2 weeks before she ever boarded the train. Gasps rippled like distant thunder. Reverend Wilkes stepped closer, peered at the writing. "You wrote this?" he asked Asa, eyes narrowing. "I did." Asa answered, voice steady. "For her?" Asa shook his head once. "No, I wrote the name in prayer. Didn't know who or why. Just felt it pressed on me. Couldn't sleep one night. It was after a storm lost half a fence line. I opened the book, and the name came. Emma. No last name, no plan, just faith." Clive scoffed from the side. "You expect us to believe that kind of fairy tale?" Asa turned his gaze to him, not angry, resolved. "I didn't send for her, but I was waiting." The weight of those words hung heavy. Emma spoke again, quieter now. "I thought I was lost. I thought I was a mistake. But he saw me before I ever came. Not as property, not as scandal, just as someone." Marshal Lyle said nothing. He simply looked to the townsfolk. Wilkes stepped back and addressed them all. "You've heard the claims, you've seen the proof. The question isn't guilt anymore. The question is whether this town believes in mercy, or in the letter of a law bent to break good people." One by one, hands rose. Not to cast out, but to protect. Clive's smirk faltered. He pushed off the post, shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and left the room. Asa let out a long breath. Not relief, something quieter, deeper. Emma handed him back the Bible. Their fingers touched. He took it, closed it gently, and held it to his chest like a vow. Wrong Gulch had spoken, not just in words but in the choice to shield what once it sought to shun. The sky stretched wide and bare above the plains, a canvas of soft gold and silver clouds drifting like old hymns across the horizon. The wind came steady, not harsh now, but steady like breath. Like promise. The people of Wrong Gulch had returned to their chores, to their fences and plows and porch repairs. The news had already quieted into something else, not scandal, but story. And in that hush, on a rise just west of Asa's land, stood a crooked archway built from reclaimed timber, weather-beaten, scarred, but upright. Beneath it, 2 figures faced each other. No lace veil, no bouquet, no preacher save for Reverend Wilkes, reading from a psalm with more humility than judgment this time. There was no crowd, no orchestra. Just the wind, the prairie, and the way Asa's hands held Emma's like they were anchoring her to the earth and lifting her all at once. She wore a plain dress, light blue, patched at the hem. He wore his work coat over a clean shirt. His Bible sat open on a crate nearby, pages rustling in the wind like they, too, wanted to bear witness. There were no rings, just a single piece of braided horsehair tied around her finger, his from a favorite gelding long buried under cottonwood. "I do," she said, voice clear. "I will," he replied, low and sure. No kiss followed. Just a touch, foreheads pressed together, eyes closed as if the two of them needed the world to still itself long enough for the vow to settle. Behind them, the marshal packed his saddle, the weight of justice less heavy now. Clive Langley had been fined and sanctioned, his land claims frozen. His name soured in the mouths of even those who once called him neighbor. He hadn't been seen in 3 days. The Langleys would recover, but not forget. And more importantly, not try again. Emma stood at the window that night, staring out at the open range, where fence posts dotted the fields like commas between hard-earned sentences. In her lap, a fresh sheet of paper. The pen dipped. The ink flowed. "Dear Lottie," she wrote, "you asked if he was everything I hoped for. I can't say yes to that, not because he's less, but because I hoped for too little. He wasn't the man I was promised. But he was the one God delivered." She paused, looking over at Asa, asleep in the chair with his boots still on, a book slumped across his chest. "He didn't save me. He gave me a place to stand. And I chose to stay." Outside, the wind picked up again, not sharp, just moving. She folded the letter, sealed it, and set it on the table for the next mail wagon out of town. The detour that brought her here would never make sense on paper. It wasn't logic that built a life out of ashes. It was something quieter, stronger, measured not in miles but in mercy. What if the detour was the destination all along?